Thank you to everyone who made the wheels turn to get me here. I thought there'd be a crack about the fact that there's no power in Adelaide, and I was probably glad to get over here to a state that doesn't go out and have a complete shutdown, but thanks for saving me from that. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I really like your topic about the future of work and about paid and unpaid work. And I really like the fact that your overall frame as a society really is about inequality. I think inequality is such an important thing in our society at the moment, and it's clearly widening with very significant widening of income with our top 10 ASX listed companies, the CEOs of them now getting 100 times what an average worker in Australia earns, and really extremely obscene levels of disparity with the Telstra boss, for example, now getting 163 times what an average telecom worker is paid. And in the US, of course, we're a minor player relative to some of our trading partners, but in the US, the top 500 companies, the CEOs on average are around 216 times the average American wage. And of course, we've got a presidential candidate who boasts that not paying tax is smart. So, there are degrees of disaster which are worse than Australia, but we are paying a significant price in terms of inequality, not only in our changing politics and the disenfranchised feeling a lot of people who are poor or poorer. I think we pay a very big price, all the OECD research tells us, in terms of our social capital and the strength of our communities. So I'm going to focus on some aspects of work and unpaid work and the ways in which we work where we're not properly remunerated. And it's a really important engine, the workplace, for creating and reinforcing inequality. Whether you're low paid or without pay, there are big ramifications beyond the individual worker in terms of being poorly paid or not paid at all. The worker is certainly affected by the injustice of poor pay, and it affects productivity and your commitment to your workplace. But there's big ramifications for those you live with in terms of dependents and children. Access to education, of course, really sharply shaped by household income. And we know now from our retirement system that living in your 40s and 50s or 30s without decent pay for long periods in and out of the labour market on low pay or in internships and so on means that it casts a long shadow into your years past 55 and 60 in retirement with our superannuation system. So I think there's a lot here to talk about, and I've been asked to reflect on unpaid work, and I think it's a really important concept, but I prefer the term labour theft because it's stealing. Getting something from someone without proper remuneration is actually theft. And that's kind of an old Wobblies term, if you like, theft. It's theft of workers. And it's the work you do when you're not being rewarded for it, or you're not getting conditions which should be associated with that work. I know Tilly's going to talk about internships, which is so important, but I'm going to concentrate on a few other forms of that theft. The first one I'm going to talk about is underpayment, because I think not being paid the proper rate is a form of theft and a form of unpaid contribution. The second is unpaid working time, which so many people who work long hours are contributing to our society, even as we meet here tonight. The third one is around payment for working at unsocial times. There's a big debate about penalty rates underway in our country, and I'd like to say something about that. Fourthly, work intensification, the contribution you make to your industry, to your workplace, to the profit or to the public service that you make by working harder and faster. And finally, I'd like to say something about unpaid domestic work and care. But first I want to set the context before going to those themes, and I want to talk about 4 different factors which you've already considered in this series in some ways, but we're seeing growth in various forms of unpaid work in the context of a very significant set of changes in our society. And the first of these changes, which you'll all be very familiar with, I'm sure, is the growing insecurity of work and the way in which that sets the temperature in the workplace and enables and facilitates theft. If you feel insecure, then you are much less likely to blow the whistle on not being paid properly or not being paid at all or not getting proper conditions. And we know that we are a standout case next to Spain in the developed world, with 1 in 4 Australian workers now in some form of precarious work, most of them casual. and we know there are growing forms of bogus contracting. So insecurity is a really important background factor which shapes the way in which people can call out contributing their work unpaid. It really inhibits employee voice. It really inhibits the way in which you can stand up for yourself. The second factor, which I think is really important in shaping the temperature in our workplaces, is the feminisation of work. The really major change in our labour market in the last 30 years has been the decline in male participation and the rapid increase in female participation, so that our workforce now is almost 1 in 2 female, and 40% of workers at work now on any day of the week are responsible for the care of someone else. And that changes your footing as a worker as well. If you go back to 1960, our labour market was much more made up of full-time men who had the backing, in more cases than not, of a union, and who could collectivise and speak up in a way that when you have a workforce made up of people who are responsible for someone at home who they must be putting food on the table for, they are the sole earner in many cases. That's the most rapid form of family type in Australia. That changes the politics and power in the workplace, and that's a really important factor as well. The third factor is technology, and you've clearly considered that already in this series, but the fracturing of a boundary around the time and place of work really changes the whole negotiation over what you deliver in the form of labour in exchange for what income. So workers are increasingly unbounded from a workplace, and there is no boundary around the workplace, around the working day. So if you're in a manufacturing sector, the regulation of working time is so much easier than now in our workforce, where 75% of the workforce is in the service sector. So it's really tricky to maintain a clear boundary, and it's very difficult for unions to manage working time, let alone for individual workers. It really changes the equation. The fifth factor that I think is really important, of course, is the rate of unionisation. And all of the developed world has been affected in the way that Australia has by a rapid decline in effective rates of unionisation. Unions have, in Australian history, performed such an important role as the silent check on enforcement. There will be someone in a workplace in the 60s who knows what the award says and will be watching out for the breaches, whether they're formally in the role of a shop steward or not. Now the majority of our workforce have no such army of people ensuring fairness, and we must instead rely on the force of the state, which is very weak in many workplaces in terms of the machinery of enforcement. So we've really lost two things when we've lost union density. One is the enforcement in a workplace, and the second is the ability and the strength to create new labour standards in significant ways, and especially labour standards around working time. So this set of conditions, those 5 factors, have really set the ground to make it much easier to thieve from workers. So I want to turn to the first form of unpaid labour, and that's the question of underpayment, and that's working for less than the hourly rate or other conditions that are in the black and white law of your workplace. And most workplaces in Australia have some form of minimum black letter regulation. Australia has very good labour law relative to many other countries. We've got a reasonably high minimum wage rate compared to many countries in the OECD. The problem is that in so many of our workplaces, especially those that have grown rapidly, there is very, very weak enforcement. And that's most obvious in the private sector, where young people work, and in the hospitality sector in particular. And if you look at the research of the Fair Work Ombudsman, which is our actual mechanism for regulating, they've actually had a close look, for example, at hospitality. And it is truly shocking. Their findings tell us that more than half of the industry, that the compliance rate of labour law in the hospitality sector sits around 50%. So almost half of our hospitality workplaces, the government regulator tells us, are not meeting the proper standards in terms of pay rates, keeping paperwork, supplying a pay slip to a worker. And look, you only have to sit down with any group of people under 25 and every one of them will have an experience like that, whose family is not regaled. I'm horrified. It's when my family gets together, of everyone who's under 25 struggling in hospitality, even if they are in a formal apprenticeship arrangement or in a reasonably large employer situation. I think the underpayment question is something that we really need to turn our attention to in terms of improving our regulation system. We concentrate so much on black letter law and improving our awards, and that's important, and our agreements. But I think the compliance stories in Australia are also very important. The second sort of area of, just sticking with the hospitality for a second, we're talking about pubs, we're talking about hotels, accommodation, fast food, convenience stores. There really is a black market in so many parts of our hospitality sector where we've got people accepting cash in hand, and there's really fabulous research coming out of Sydney University which tells us that the immigrant community, the immigrant student community in particular, there's just a going rate, it's $10 an hour throughout Chinatown in Sydney, everyone knows it. And that's what you accept when you're a student. So it's a really important problem in our system, that question of underpayment. And there's an accompanying second part of that is, and with 1 in 4 of our workers now casual or in some form of impermanent precarious employment, we've lost a basic condition for many people beyond pay, and that is the opportunity to take paid sick leave or a paid holiday. And that was a really important win for our labour movement. A century ago and over the years after we won, in theory, the 8-hour day. We really have lost for so many people a very basic right. So lots of casual workers work every week of the year. Many of them work full time and they don't get any paid holiday. And a country like New Zealand has addressed that by saying you should get, and their law says, you will get paid holiday leave proportional to your working time over a 12-month period, and that should be your right as a worker. If you look at the breakdown of the casual leave loading, it doesn't cover all of the conditions that you lose as a casual. It covers a portion of them, and it is so vital for workers to have sick leave. It's the way in which many people manage not only their own bodies but that of those dependents that they have at home, and it's so important to have for our workers. So that is something which I really think we should be considering in the reform of our workplace relations system. The second thing I want to mention in terms of theft is that very straightforward question of working for nothing and working unpaid time. So just over 1 in 4 Australian workers report working unpaid hours. So 1 in 4 people are donating their time to their employers. And it's in many industries and occupations. It's famous, in places like schools, for teachers, in universities and so on. But there's now a very diverse range of industries and occupations where people are donating their time. And for many people, it's about insecurity and fear. For others, it's about making sure they're on the top of the list when a promotion or a development opportunity comes up. For others, it's about loving their job. And I interviewed lots of different workers for the ACTU case for a reasonable hours test case in 2002, 2003. And for example, in the racing industry, strappers, they're on absolute minimum wage, very low wages. And they love horses so much that they do incredible long hours to the detriment of their health. And really make such a great contribution in an unpaid way to the racing industry. So it's not just professors, it's a bunch of people in all kinds of minimum wage jobs who are donating their time. We also know that one of the reasons that this is expanding and people giving more time in unpaid ways is the use of technologies, which mean you've always got your job next to you. Many people are picking up their job before they get out of bed in the morning and checking their email. I know there are people in this room who do that. And it's not good for your work-life balance, all the research tells us, but for many people, the majority of people who do it, say they do it in order to stay on top of their job. Things just run away really quickly in terms of email and control of stuff electronically, and it's really an intrusive issue, and it's really affecting many people. So we've got a really unfortunate badge of dishonour as Australians now, with our very high proportion of Australians who work very long hours of work. 14% of our workforce are working 50 hours a week according to OECD data, and that means we're fourth ranked in the world out of 34 OECD countries for the proportion of workers who are doing very long hours of work, 50 hours or more. Most of them are men, but there is a growing number of women also joining them. And this is such an important reality which is bad for our society. And if you take nothing else out of my contribution tonight, I just want to tell you what the latest research tells us about what those long hours do to you. There's a really significant study. We didn't have this in front of us when we were arguing to the Industrial Relations Commission in the early 2000s that we need to regulate long hours of work, but we now have it. Last year published in The Lancet. 600,000 people in the study, a lot of them Australians, from all around the world. And that study showed that if you work 50 hours or more, you have a 33% higher rate of stroke than if you work 35 to 40 hours a week. So that is the largest, stroke is the biggest explanator of untimely death in Australia. So we have a lot of people falling over and in our health system because they're doing these long hours and giving up their time without pay. And there was also, that data showed a 13% higher rate of a coronary heart failure if you did long hours of work. So there's a really significant cost to our society and to us as individuals. Unfortunately, while it's a really important issue, the Productivity Commission, for example, in its latest review of workplace relations, paid no attention in a serious way, no recommendations on long hours of work and how they needed to be regulated. Their position was basically people choose to do long hours of work, they love their jobs, and by and large over time they move through them, so we don't need to worry about it. Well, this is wrong. We really do have a problem of long hours, and we've really let ourselves down in failing to regulate it. The third issue I want to mention is around the donation of special time for our employers and for our society and economy. And I'm thinking here particularly about penalty rates. And there's a big push on, as you would all know, against penalty rates and treating Sunday in particular as a special day. And I want to just tell you that the Productivity Commission looked at that, and it's going to come out, the Industrial Relations Commission will come out with its response pretty soon. Well, I think they've deferred it now for a few months. But what we have is a world where many commentators will stand up and say we now all live in a 24/7 economy and penalty rates don't matter. It doesn't matter what day of the week or what time you work. That is not true. 62% of Australians still work Monday to Friday before 9 p.m. Most of us, the majority of us, actually still have a working day that fits in fairly clear parameters. There is certainly growth in the proportion of people who work on Saturdays and Sundays and at night, but we have good research about that which says people have much worse work-life balance if they work on a Sunday than if they work on a Saturday. There's something quite distinctive about a Sunday, and think about it for 3 minutes. I know as a carer of people in their 90s, the only way I can get my family together is on a Sunday. As soon as you have young people around you and an older person and you want them to get together, Sunday is the sacred space. And that's what the research data shows us. So the argument that we should do away with special payments for people who work unsocial times is also a form of labour theft, and I'm glad that many people are resisting it and questioning that push against penalty rates. The fourth area I want to mention is the way in which people now give a lot more with any given hour relative to what they did years ago. There's lots of research now in Australia about intensification. I've done surveys myself which show, for example, that almost 40% of Australian workers say they are working at very high speed 3/4 of the time or more. Many, similar proportion, around 40%, say they work to tight timelines 3/4 of the time or more. A third believe they have too much work to do for one person. And these questions are universally used around the globe so we compare country to country. And the answers in Australia, the proportion of people who say they're feeling really pressured, are much higher than in Europe, for example. And that wouldn't have been the case, I'd say, 30 or 40 years ago. We have nurses now trying to control the number of very high need patients in front of them, where they can sometimes set staffing ratios. That's not easy to do in many other workplaces. And so as a consequence, we have people really doing sweated labour at high intensity, and that's a form of labour theft as well. Finally, I want to mention unpaid domestic work and care. The feminisation of our labour market has really transformed not only our workplaces but also our homes over the past 30 years. When we had the male breadwinner model with, the man at home and, the wrong way around, the woman at home and the man heading out the gate off to work and back home at 5:30 or 6 o'clock, we had a way of managing unpaid labour and care work which for all its problems, and it certainly disempowered women, and it meant they didn't have, for example, very powerful resources like money to leave a circumstance of violence or lack of safety. We did have a way of looking after people who needed it, kids and older citizens. We've got a massive demographic shift underway in our society at present, with a really significant increase in the number of people over 60 who are going to be needing forms of care, many of them personal family member to member care. And our shift to a dual earner household has meant the intensification of work, especially for working carers, most of them women. So we now have, for the first time in Australia, a generation of women coming out of the labour market who have spent 40 years raising a family and holding down a job, much of it that time full-time on the way through. Many Australian women work part-time, but over their working lives they will be holding together both a job and responsibility for children, raising kids. And when you think about what that does to a street, to a community, and to the way in which a worker can work, it's a really profound change, and it's intensified the demands on women, so that I think and at the same time, of course, it's really affected the amount of superannuation they take into their retirement, with women having half, on average, the superannuation balances of men, and nothing like an amount that really will make any difference to their circumstances in old age. So I really think we haven't managed well the transition at home that has been brought about by the shift in participation rates in our labour market. And if you look at who does what in the home, it's really been unchanged in any significant way, despite that coming together of male and female participation rates. Men aren't doing, on average, much more domestic work than they did 20 years ago. The ABS aren't collecting the data right now, so we're relying on data that's nearly 10 years old. But the uncare work still falls to women at the same time as their households are increasingly relying on their income. So I think we've got plenty of challenges ahead in our regulation system, in our enforcement system, and in our own relationships, if we're going to make unpaid work in combination with paid work fairer into the future. Thank you.